Welcome to week 2 of HI2009, when we're going to start dealing with historical evidence, as well as big ideas. This week we're heading back to 1788, which is taken as the date that settler colonialism starts on the Australian continent. It's a convenient rather than a perfect date for starting the subject, but it's an interesting time to assess what we know about the Australian continent and about contact that occurs with European people. Now, 1788, the first fleet arrives in Sydney Cove. Settler colonialism, as it arrives in Australia, is peculiar. We'll look at that. It doesn't arrive everywhere all at once. We'll pick up on that as well. And it interacts with a whole lot of different groups of people, something we'll also deal with this week. And so this week, in this lecture, we're looking at that starting point at Australia in 1788 and at what we know about war, the Australian people, Australian society of various types in that period, and what occurs here. So here's how we're going to do it. We'll return in the second video to the historiography of Australia's frontier wars, and we'll place them in the context briefly of the British Empire, and we'll delve into quite how much conflict we're talking about in Australia and what kinds of forms it took. The third video picks up very much on the themes of commemoration, and the Learn JCU folder includes other videos for you to look at, so you get a sense of the broad interest in this topic. And that idea of broad interest and of the contentiousness of this topic is picked up in the key questions. It is and continues to be a contentious topic in Australian public discourse. Those first two questions relate to the Australian frontier itself, and it's something to consider. With war in particular, it's interesting to consider when Australian history becomes Australian history and not the history of the British Empire as a whole. And with war, it's useful to consider what war is, why we consider it legitimate violence, and how sometimes it bleeds into what we're not willing to accept as legitimate forms of violence. This week there's a fair further reading list, but because this topic is so very alive and has been a hot topic of debate within the 21st century, this list is limited. It's limited to studies that are considered really central or that are quite recent. You'll notice that Henry Reynolds features twice, and I think that's fair enough. You're reading Henry Reynolds for tutorial this week. He raises some very interesting ideas, and he's certainly a key figure in the historiography of frontier war in Australia. He was also a professor at James Cook University, and we're fortunate that he visits us regularly and speaks on campus. And here we are. Why are we starting in 1788? Because it's a convenient date. But what does starting there tell us? And why don't we start earlier? And the reason I'm not starting the subject earlier, I'm not starting with war on the Australian continent before the colonial period, is because it's very difficult to establish. War in prehistory is difficult to study, and by prehistory, I mean history where there are no written records. There are records of Aboriginal Australia, and Aboriginal Australia is very old. This map is an interesting artefact created by an anthropologist in the 1940s, but you're probably more familiar with its more recent versions, which are more clearly coloured, in places use different names and perhaps slightly different boundaries, but which is protected by copyright, whereas this one is not. And this one is itself an interesting historical artefact. Within it, you can see separate country. You can see the idea of different groups of people recognising themselves as separate in some way from their neighbours and people further afield. You'll be familiar with the idea that Australia has a huge number of Indigenous languages, and I hope you're familiar with that idea of diversity and diverse groups within Indigenous Australia. This is important for two reasons this week. The first is that it means the history of the frontier is a different history in different places. while there might be some continuity among Europeans, I think it's useful to see the frontier as evolving across the Australian continent, coming to different places at different times. And it makes for a mass of different conflicts. But the map is useful in another way. Sovereignty, particularly Indigenous sovereignty, is a concept that's getting thrown around a lot at present. And for us, in this subject, it's important because it means there's a potential of a political entity for settlers to be at war with. Remember that idea that war is a tool of states, or at least of statecraft. And so the recognition of political entities is important. The map too, and in the current discourse, the importance now of welcome to country ceremonies can inform this subject because it tells us that there is a tradition of recognition of difference, recognition of political groups and their connection to a particular country, and the existence of diplomacy, and diplomacy reaching back into pre-colonial times. At contact, Europeans recognise certain Indigenous people, Indigenous men generally, as warriors, and that's important for us too. Within Indigenous tradition, there's also this recognition of figures as warriors, and so the sense that war is possible. Interracial war occurs in Australia, and in theory, looking at this map, it might be expected that our definition of war could expand back into the pre-colonial period. But that's difficult to do. And often discussion of war in prehistory is very loosely associated with evidence because evidence is difficult to obtain. Archaeologists like skeletons, but skeletons can't give you clear information about politics. People can die in war from wounds that leave no traces on their skeletons. And even if there is trace of violent death, generally it's impossible to say whether that wound was received through war, this political activity, or through something that doesn't quite qualify, like murder, or a raid which doesn't meet the threshold of being war. And so discussion of war in hunter-gatherer communities in particular tends to be a philosophical discussion about human nature. And there are a whole lot of books written on this topic. There's a reference in that further reading list whether humans, before the advent of civilization, lived lives that were, as Thomas Hobbes put it, nasty, brutish and short, or whether we lived in a state of nature more in tune with the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's a philosophical debate. As historians, I think we need to stick with the evidence. And the evidence here tells us that war is a possibility, but we don't have evidence to know what happens before written records make the past available to us. And I know there are oral traditions that reach back into the pre-colonial period, but I'm not aware of work that interrogates them for clear evidence of violent conflict between political entities. And I'm not sure it's respectful to interrogate them in that way. We can note evidence of political entities, we can note evidence of warriors, and once the settlers get here, clear evidence that Aboriginal people know how to fight effectively and to resist intruders. But I don't think we can write a history of war before 1788 on the Australian continent. And while others are enthralled by that discussion about human nature and whether we are less violent than humans in the past, I'm not convinced of its value. The Europeans who came to Australia in 1788 were clearly familiar with war. We have histories of wars in Europe that reach back thousands of years. So the people that arrived were familiar, but they don't all arrive at once. They don't all arrive in 1788. There had been earlier encounters. Those encounters varied. It's not worth going into them in detail here. Around the north and the west, There were pirates who bumped into the continent. There were traders of the Dutch East India Company. And while that was a private company, those people were familiar with waging war on the company's behalf. It was one of the rights that was granted to it by the Dutch government. Contact between Europe and the east coast of the Australian continent was probably first conducted by that Endeavour expedition captained by Cook. And here we could see the nature of Europe at this time. It is a naval expedition. The image here is of one of the cannon of that ship. The crew of the ship threw heavy objects overboard when it ran into the Great Barrier Reef, and they were lucky that they succeeded in saving the ship itself. As a result, we have artifacts like this one, and as a result, we have to recognise that when Europe reached out to the wider world, when it sent expeditions to explore, it sent expeditions that were associated with its navies, and it sent them armed. Those voyages experienced violence perpetrated by both the Europeans and by the various indigenous peoples that they encountered. The ships were vulnerable. They were the crew's lifeline. They defended them. And they defended them against potential threats, as well as against actual attacks by the people that they encountered. War is not an aim of these expeditions, although violent deaths occur. And it could be argued that there were incidents of war during expeditions of exploration. But the point here is that these were intriguing expeditions associated with the potential of war. And when we get to 1788, the situation of New South Wales, of that first settlement at Sydney, is again an interesting one, in that this is a peculiar moment in European history where Britain establishes a penal colony. This distinguishes it from most other colonisation attempts, and it makes the nature of Sydney something peculiar. When it arrives, the First Fleet is a government enterprise, and it carries convicts and those sent to guard and control convicts. The threats to early Sydney come initially from within, and then as the resources in the local area dwindle from without as well. The colony that's established at Sydney is used to violence, it's structured towards violence, it has men trained in violence in the forms of the soldiers, other men who have often resorted to violence in the convicts, and violence is an essential part of the society. It also lands in Sydney at a difficult time of year, and it's slow to become self-supporting. And it lands in one of the more inhabited parts of Australia. If you look back at that Tyndall map of the recognised groups of Indigenous Australia, you'll notice the sections which have more detailed maps provided. And you'll notice that they tend to correspond with the centres of settlement in Australia at present. That's because those are the more richly resourced regions of the continent, and so the more richly peopled. And that's where we are by the end of 1788. We're on a continent that has Indigenous political groups that recognise country as their own, and we have newcomers who have arrived as part of a British government experiment, and a difficult experiment. The colony demands resources from its local area, it's slow to become self-supporting. It's an interesting situation, and the violence and the interracial violence which starts to occur soon after the arrival of the First Fleet in Sydney Cove is now recognised as the beginning of a series of frontier wars on the Australian continent. And here we are. We've set the scene.